Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. In honor of starting the fifth chapter of Zevachim, the chapter called Ezehu Mekoman, Where is Their Place? A chapter that is all about how different korbanot are done, specifically how they are slaughtered near the external Mizbeach altar, and how their blood is put onto that altar, in addition to entrails, as the case may be. We are going to talk about the altar, the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach has such deep symbolism. It is the most frequently and disparately used item in the Mikdash, in the sanctum. And I want to just take a 10,000 foot take before you look at the very detailed orientation towards the Mizbeach. A nice 10,000 foot take on what is the symbolism of the Mizbeach, or what are the symbolisms of the Mizbeach, and how does that lend to the character of the Mikdash as a whole. So first things first, I want you to see just where this Mizbeach is. For those who are listening and not looking, I would suggest that you just Google online or look online where, even if you don't want to see the video, the source sheet, you'll notice that there is a section that is so clearly all the way to the left of the diagram, so clearly the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, to its right, and that's where you have the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant, to its right, separated by a parochet, by a curtain, you have what we call the Kodesh, the Holy. And there you have a golden altar, which was for incense, the Mizbach HaZahav. There you have the Shulchan, the table for the showbreads. And there you have the menorah, the candelabra that was lit. You have to leave that whole space and walk down steps to get to the Mizbeach that I'm talking about. The Mizbeach on which korbanot were given, also known as the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the external Mizbeach. So you kind of get the sense that there's something separate about that whole world of the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim on the one hand, and then the outer area where you have the Mizbeach. And that's going to be important because actually asking ourselves what is the center of gravity or the central purpose of the Mishkan, as the Torah has it, or the Mikdash later, there is actually a machloket. There's an argument between the Ramban and the Rambam. The Ramban thinks that the center of gravity of the Mikdash is really the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, and specifically the Aron HaIdut, the Ark of the Covenant that's in there. And let's read what he has to say on Parshat Truma. Kasher diber Hashem im Yisrael panim befanim, aseret hadibrot, when God spoke to the Jewish people face to face in the Ten Commandments, v'Yisrael kiblu alehem la'asot kol ma sheyitzavim al yado shel Moshe, and the Jewish people agreed to accept anything that God commanded through Moshe. V'karat imahem brit al kol zeh, and God made a covenant with them on all this. Me'ata hinehem lo la'am, v'hu lahem la'elohim. From that moment, the Jewish people, the Israelites, become God's nation, and God becomes their Lord. Hine heim kidoshim, ru'uyim sheyeh bahem mikdash, lahashrot shchinato b'nehem. What that really effectuates is they are now set aside, the word we often use as holy, but they are now set aside and worthy to have a mikdash, a holy place, where God is going to allow the divine presence to dwell among them. Lachein tziva tchila al dvar hamishkan, sheyeh lo bayit betocham, mikudash lishmo. V'sham yedaber im Moshe v'yitzaveh et bnei Israel. And it's for that reason that after Ma'amad Har Sinai, God says, I want you to build me a house. I want you to build me a Mishkan. And that is where I'm going to speak to Moshe from and command the Jewish people. V'hine ikar hachefetz b'mishkan hu makom menuchat hashchina shehu ha'aron. The whole essence of what the Mishkan is trying to achieve is that it is a place where the divine presence rests upon the Aron, the ark. Kemoshe Ne'amar, as it says, V'no'adati lecha sham, right? I will be met there by you, or I will meet with you there. V'dibarti itcha me'al hakaporet, and I will speak to you from above the covering, right? The famous cherubic covering, not cherubic, but with actual cherubs, kruvim. I will speak to you from above the covering of the Aron. Al kain hikdim ha'aron v'hakaporet bekan ki hu mukdam b'ma'ala. And that's why when the Torah lists the kelim, when the Torah lists what is going to be in the Aron, in the Mikdash, excuse me, it lists first the Aron and its cover because they are the highest level. V'samach la'aron hashochan v'hamenorah shem kelim kamohu. And then it talks about the Aron and the Shulchan. Excuse me, and then it talks about the Shulchan, the table, and the candelabra, which are also vessels. V'yoru al inyan hamishkan shebavuram ne'esa. And then it talks about the actual mivneh, the structure of the Mishkan. You see, if you look in Truma Tetzaveh, you find that the way the Torah lists the building of the Mishkan is first the kelim, first the vessels, and chief among them the Aron, and then the structure. By the way, that changes after Chet HaEgel, after the sin of the golden calf. Actually, you then get the structure first in Vayakel Pekudei, and then the kelim. You can get a sense of context actually being very important after Chet HaEgel, because after all, the Egel was also a golden kli, golden vessel, but it was not in the right context, right? But the point here is, Sod HaMishkan the secret of the Mishkan is Sheyeh HaKavod Asher Shachan Al Har Sinai Shochen Alav Benistar. That the same divine presence that was present at Sinai in public will be in the Mishkan, present in private. That's the idea. So the center of gravity for the Mishkan and later for the Mikdash is not the Mizbeach, it is the Aron. It is the Kodesh HaKodashim because it symbolizes, certainly by having the Luchot and the broken Luchot in it, and being the place where God speaks to Moshe, from which God speaks to Moshe, however we are to understand that, it is a center of divine presence. And that is what the Mishkan and the Mikdash are all about. God's presence resting among the Jewish people, God's presence being affirmative of the Brit of the covenant and a continuation of Sinai, as it were. And it's interesting to note that in that there is a halachic expression to this for the Ramban. Namely, the Ramban does not count any of the kelim, such as the shulchan, such as the menorah, such as the mizbeach, either of the mizbechot, whether the incense in the kodesh or the korbanot, the one for korbanot, which is outside. He does not count those as their own mitzvah. He says those are only, making those is a hechsher mitzvah. It's just to prepare for the mitzvah of doing the avodah. But what does he count as a separate mitzvah? Making the aron and its kaporet. That is its own mitzvah. It is the center of gravity. And I included that source. The Ramban says this when he is commenting on the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, the Rambam's book where he lists what mitzvot he counts in his 613. And the Ramban has Hasagot, has comments on that where he disagrees with the Rambam. In this particular case, the Rambam had been saying he wants to count the mitzvah of the Kohanim making and wearing Bigdei Kehuna as its own mitzvah. And the Ramban says, absolutely not. No way. Those are just a hechsher mitzvah. They're just preparation for a mitzvah. Just like the other kelim in the Mishkan. And in that context, he says, but wait, the Aron is its own thing. Now that's the Ramban. For the Rambam, however, the center of gravity is the Mizbeach. And not the Mizbach HaZahav, not the golden altar where you give the incense that's in the Kodesh, but rather the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the external Mizbeach where the korbanot that you're going to see in the 5th chapter of Zevachim are to be given a Mizbeach that is humongous, actually, at least when it comes to in the Mikdash, it is humongous. You walk up to it on a ramp and you look small in comparison to it. A Mizbeach that is not made of gold. In the Mishkan, it is meant to be made of bronze, okay, or overlaid with bronze, I should say, okay. For the Rambam, this is the center of gravity, right? The size of the Mishkan was different. The size of the Mizbeach was different in the Mishkan versus in the Mikdash, but in the Mikdash it was humongous. Okay? So the Rambam says in number 3, and even in the two Batei Mikdash, it was slightly different sizes. The Rambam says in number 3 in the Sefer HaMitzvot, in the 20th mitzvah say, positive commandment of his list, והמצווה ה-20 היא שציוונו לבנות בית עבודה. The mitzvah is to build a Beit HaMikdash for worship. Bo yiyeh hakrava, there is where sacrifices will be given. V'havarat ha'esh tamid, and a constant source of fire. Ve'elav yiyeh halicha v'aliyah l'regel v'hakibutz b'chol shana. And that is where everyone will go. Sorry that I laughed. That is where everyone will go. I got a message from my child on the side, a very responsible person. Um, let's try that again. And that is where people will go on Aliyah Regel, on pilgrimage every year. And that's the pasuk that says, Mikdash v'shachati right? Make me a sanctuary and I will live among you, right? Binyan beit bechira mitzvah bifnei atzma, right? Building the chosen house, meaning the Beit HaMikdash, is a mitzvah in and of itself. But notice he doesn't say it's a mitzvah to build a house where God's presence will dwell. He says it is a mitzvah to build a house where we can perform worship before God. And in fact, that is how he starts in the Mishnah Torah, his halachic work. That's how he starts the beginning of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the chosen house. In Halakha Aleph, in Perek Aleph, he says, Mitzvah aseh lasot bayit laHashem. It is a positive commandment to make a house for God, Muchan liyot makrivim bo hakorbanot, a place in which people can give sacrifices, right? And then he goes and talks about Aliyah Regel also. The focus here is on the worship, not on the divine presence. Of course, the reason why the worship is going to be done there is because it is a bayit laHashem, but the focus is on our responsibility to give korbanot there, to show up there. And in fact, when he enumerates what the kalim, what the vessels in the Mikdash are supposed to be, unlike the Torah itself, which counts the Aron first, he counts the external Mizbeach first. In Halakha Vav, in that same parak, it says, V'osim b'Mikdash shiv'a kelim. For the Mikdash, we're going to make 7 vessels. A Mizbeach le'olah u'l'shar korbanot. There's going to be this is why sometimes the Mizbeach hachitzon, or the Mizbach נחושת, sometimes also called the Mizbach העולה, right? Because you're going to give an Ola Korban Tamid there every morning and every afternoon, right? It's going to be the altar for the Ola, for the completely burnt offerings, and for other korbanot. And then you also have to make a kevesh, you have to make a ramp, she'olin bo lamizbeach, that you can walk up to get to the mizbeach, and it tells you where it's going to be. You also have to make a shiur, vikano, you have to make, I don't know the fancy words, there are fancy words for these things, but you have to make something that is going to, like a faucet, a sink that's going to wash the hands. I don't remember the fancy word for it right now, and a basin into which that water is going to flow. L'kadesh mimenu kohanim yedehem v'raglehem la'avodah. Why? Because you need to wash the kohanim's hands and their feet before they do the worship. And then he says where that is. And then he says, and then there's the Mizbeach l'ktoret, the altar for incense, which is, I'm saying, is in the Kodesh, right? Well, actually, he's going to say it in a second. The menorah and the shulchan, ushloshtan betoch hakodesh lifnei kodesh hakodeshim, right? So he basically says, I'm going to go from the outside, the Mizbeach HaChitzon, all the way to the inside, right? But it's so clear that for him, the focus is on the avoda. The focus is on korbanot. The center of gravity is the Mizbeach, not the Aron. Now, it's interesting. I saw an article by a Yitzchak Hershkovitz, who noted that when you think about where things are placed, where vessels are placed within the Mikdash, the more something is used, the further outside it is. So the Mizbach Ha'olah is used constantly, right? Whereas, let's go to the Kodesh HaKodashim, all the way internal. Once a year, one person can go in there. So it doesn't surprise me, and it doesn't surprise him, that for the Rambam, everything revolves around the Mizbeach, the external Mizbeach, because the external Mizbeach is where the action is happening in a constant way, and it is what actually, on a consistent basis, builds that relationship between God and the people. But I want to think a little more deeply about what it means to suggest that the center of gravity is the Aron, and the purpose of the Mishkan is for God's presence to dwell, versus the center of gravity being the external Mizbeach, and the purpose is for us to do avodah. So one thing to suggest is that for the Ramban, the focus is more on what God is doing there. And for the Rambam, the focus is more on what we are doing there, right? Or our obligation, right? Maybe for the Ramban, the focus is more on chosenness. For the Rambam, the focus is more on responsibility, or we might say rights versus duties, or privileges versus duties. You also might say that the Ramban, especially as such a Kabbalist, is actually more drawn to understanding a place where humanity and the divine meet as being specifically in the place where nobody goes most of the time. Whereas the rationalist, the Rambam, is going to focus on the very clear guidelines of how you're supposed to do particular rituals, rather than on kind of the mysterium tremendum, the great mystery of it all. But I want to look at a few other things because I'm not even sure it's that simple. There happens to be a midrashic source called the Breita de Melechet HaMishkan, and it discusses where exactly does God speak to Moshe from, or from where does God speak to Moshe? Me'echan hayta shechina medaberet im Moshe, right? From where? So there are three opinions here, and I think it's important to consider what these three opinions are saying. Rabbi Natan Omer min ha'ohel. Rabbi Natan says it's from the tent, right? I want you to actually think, if you've seen diagrams or pictures of that beautiful book, Hamishkan, that shows you a miniature version of what the Mishkan would have looked like. You see that some of it is covered over, right? That's the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodeshim. The part that's covered over is not the courtyard, right? It's the part that's covered over. That we would call the Ohel. So Rabbi Natan thinks that's where God speaks to Moshe from. It's a little bit it's not super specified, but what it's saying is it's not outside in the courtyard, right? Where does he get that from? Well, you have a pasuk in Shemot, Perek Lamed, v'natata oto lifnei haparochet, asher al aron ha'edut, lifnei hakaporet asher al ha'edut, asher ivaed lecha shama, right? And there's a description of putting a parochet, putting a, curtain, right? God speaks from behind the curtain, as it were, right? So even maybe within the structure of that covered area, there's even maybe it's relating specifically to the parochet, the curtain that separates the Kodesh from the Kodesh, from the Kodesh Kodeshim. But certainly it's the internal piece. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai says, no, actually, It's from the Mizbach. It's from the golden altar, the incense altar. And he also has a pasuk from that same chapter in Shemot, where God says the same terminology of Asher Iva'ed L'chashama. I'm going to speak to you there, Moshe, right? I'm going to meet with you there. I'm going to be seen by you there. And it's on the incense. Now that's in the Kodesh, right? So what we've done is, okay, maybe if Rabbi Natan's saying from the Ohel, and then he's speaking specifically to the Parochet, so maybe the Parochet is a little closer to the Kodesh Kodeshim, right? And then Rabbi Shimon ben Azai takes us out a little bit more to the Mizbach HaKtorah, which is in the Kodesh, squarely. And then the Talmidim, the students of Rabbi Yishmael, are quoted as saying, oh, it's actually Me'etzel Mizbach HaOlah. Well, actually, no, quoting a different pasuk where the same terminology is used, Asher Iva'ed Lachem Shama, where I will meet you there, God says. But it's said about our external Mizbeach. Now, our external Mizbeach is not in the covered part. It's in the courtyard part, right? And now, so we've moved out further. So I love this midrash because this midrash is basically having the conversation of the Rambam and the Ramban, right? And basically saying, okay, like where is God going to meet with Moshe in the Mishkan? Is it going to be as close to the Kodesh Kodeshim as possible? Is it going to be a little further out? Or is it going to be all the way on the Mizbach Haolah? And I also like this because I think the idea that God would meet with Moshe in the place where kind of like the day-to-day slaughter and throwing of the blood and the very public nature and the very ritualized area that it is and the very nitty-gritty that's going on there, the idea that that's where God would speak to Moshe versus, oh no, God actually speaks to Moshe like in the curtain that's right near the Kodesh Kodeshim that nobody's really around much, right? It gives you different perspectives. Not are we focused on God in the Mishkan or are we focused on human avoda in the Mishkan, but actually where is God found, right? So some religious personality questions here of where people think God is found. So I don't think the Rambam versus the Ramban is the only way we have to take this question of, oh, the Mizbeach represents the avoda and the Aron represents Hashrat HaShechina, right? The divine presence. I think this Midrash is trying to suggest the divine presence can be in both places, right? The divine presence can be in both places. Now, suffice to say, it is speaking about God talking to Moshe. It's not talking about God speaking to everybody, but nonetheless, it breaks down the binary a little bit. I also want to do one more thing, which is I want to talk about this Mizbeach. It's strange not only because it's outside and it's so public and it's so, as opposed to other things we associate with the Mishkan or with the Mikdash. But it's also strange because the Torah says it is Nechoshet, it's bronze. Whereas the stuff in the Kodesh is either made fully of gold, right? Like the menorah, for example, or is covered in gold. The altar incense is a great foil because it's gold, right? So the idea that the Mizbeach HaNechoshet is Nechoshet, that it's copper or bronze. It's actually less fancy, less expensive. So some people make something of that symbolism, and I think it's beautiful. So first of all, the Midrash Tanchuma tells us, it's a late Midrash. Both of the Midrashim that I'm going to bring here are late Midrash. They're medieval Midrash. So the Tanchuma, V'tzipita oto nechoshet, you're supposed to cover the external Mizbech with bronze or copper. V'lama hayat tzipuyo nechoshet. Why was it covered in copper? L'chaper al metzach hanechoshet. To give kapara, to give atonement for our copper or bronze foreheads. Shenemar, as it says in Yeshayahu, midati, I know, Hashem says, ki kashe ata, you are hard, meaning you are stubborn. Vigid barzel or pecha, and your oref, the nape of your neck, is like an iron gid. It's like an iron sinew. You can't turn your neck to listen to me, right? Umitzchacha nechusha, and your forehead is bronze, right? And some people explain your forehead is bronze, like you have no shame. You'll never go pale. You're always like shiny, proud. You'll never go pale. I think you could also think about it as like, you're just hard-headed. You're just hard-headed. So why do we have the item that is most used to gain atonement over the course of the year, over and over and over again? Why do we have it gilded in copper? Because that's what we are. We're stubborn. We're hard-headed. And it's a reminder, you're hard-headed, but you come here and you're going to get kapara on all your hard-headedness. The Midrash Hagadol, which is a 14th century Yemenite text put together by Rabbi David Adani, takes from some things from the Gemara and also takes some things from like Yemenite Midrash. The tzipita oto nechoshet, you're going to cover it, you're going to overlay it in copper. Lama nechoshet, why? Lomar lecha, to tell you, ma nechoshet zo, afal bishamalet chaluda, hi mitmareket, that just like copper, even though it gets corroded, you can polish it. Kach Yisrael, afal pishein chotin. Likewise, even though the Jewish people sin, imosim tshuva mitkaper lahem. If they polish themselves, meaning if they do tshuva, if they repent, then they can be atoned for. And in fact, the Midrash Gadol goes further and does something that is so quintessentially medieval, actually. Compares and contrasts the Mizbach HaNachoshet and the Mizbech HaZahav, right? Or the Mizbach HaZahav, the copper altar external and the golden incense altar internal, and turns it into a trope of, well, one's outside, so it represents your goof, and the other one's inside, so it represents your nishama. And check it out. Tana Rabbanan, rabbis taught, Shnei Mizbechotin, there are two Mizbechot, there are two altars, Echad Zahav, Echad Nechoshet. One is gold and one is copper. Mizbech HaZahav, Nimshal B'nafsho Shel Adam, Umizbech HaNechoshet B'gufo Shel Adam. The golden altar, which is more in the Kodesh, inside, is like a person's soul, and the copper altar, which is outside, is more like a person's body. מזבח הזהב היה מונח בפנים של קודש, ומזבח הנחושת היה מונח בחצר של קודש. Right? מזבח הזהב, the golden altar is inside, and the copper altar is outside in the courtyard. מזבח הזהב לא היה נראה לעם, מזבח הנחושת היה נראה. Nobody could see the golden altar because it was in the Kodesh, meaning Kohanim could, but the people couldn't. But the copper altar people could see. Right? We even discussed a few weeks ago that Zar could do shchita, meaning a non-Kohen could do shchita for the korban. Of course, they could see the Mizbach HaNachoshet. Mizbech HaZahav aya yakar mimizbech HaNachoshet. And of course, the golden altar was more expensive. Mizbech HaZahav hayu maktirin alav ketoret samim. What do you put on the golden altar? You put wonderful smelling herbs. Mizbech HaNachoshet hayu makrivim alav basar shel behemot. And what goes on the copper altar? Flesh of animals. And this is the quintessential medieval move. Just like gold is more precious than copper, so too the soul is more precious than the body. And just like every day they would give a korban on the copper altar, and that's the same way that a person should confess and should check into what they are, their actions, and be able to look them over critically every day, lifnei Adon Olamim, before God, the sovereign of the universe, tamid, always, and to worship God with your body and with your soul. So this is magnificent what he's doing, right? It's basically saying these two altars actually complement each other or supplement each other in some way. Of one that represents the external, the goof, one that represents the internal, the nefesh, and they work together. Now, I don't actually need to decide to take any one of these readings to know that what all of them are actually showing me, whether we're talking about our stubbornness or we're talking about corrosion or we're talking about, the messiness of the goof, each one of these is actually telling me that to say that the gravity of the Mishkan or the Mikdash is on the Mizbeach is to say that the gravity of the Mikdash and the Mishkan is not on perfection. It's not on unsullied life. It is on the awareness that we as human beings are going to need to come there to gain atonement for the things that we do. That we as human beings are going to live lives that are going to be messy and are going to require an approach to the Mikdash that is not going to be the pristine experience of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, but is going to be the real everyday copper, not gold mess that is life. And if you put the gravity of the Mishkan on that, then the place where God meets human beings is a place where human beings are actually able to come and say, I did something wrong. It's a place where human beings come with a humble posture, where human beings recognize that they are not God. As always, great learning with you. Enjoy the fifth parak. I'll be with you along the way.